Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to give you a brief welcome before we get started. My name is Carrie Bergman, and I'm with the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. The ACMHE is a multidisciplinary academic association with a membership of over 800 educators, staff, students, and researchers committed to the transformation of higher education through contemplative methods. The ACMHE is an initiative of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. And I'd like to welcome you to our May 2016 Contemplative Education webinar, Contemplating Chicano Park and a New Pedagogic Imaginary, with Alberto Lopez Pulido. We'll be having a 45-minute presentation and a 10-minute question and answer period to follow. Dr. Alberto Lopez Pulido is professor and founding chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of San Diego. Alberto's scholarship recognizes the value of contemplative practices within an ethnic studies pedagogy to empower the stories and lives of students of color in higher education, along with the knowledge and truths that arise from students' communities of origin. He presents and publishes on this critical topic. Alberto's work has been featured in Laura Rendon's work on Senti Pensante scholarship and pedagogy, and he is also an award-winning documentary filmmaker with his directorial debut of Everything Comes from the Streets, a history of lowriding in San Diego, California, and the borderlands. He is currently working on a book and related articles that examine the evolution of community knowledge and expressions as a form of preservation and resistance in the history of Chicano Park and the historic barrio of Logan Heights. Alberto's presentation today will feature the important murals of Chicano Park and the significance of student engagement with and reflection on the art, its message, and its teachings. So thank you, Alberto, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to say hello to everyone and want to share that this is a real honor to be able to have people listening to my words and to my ideas. So I can't thank the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society enough for making this possible. Carrie, Jen, and then some colleagues like Louis at USD, Laura Rendón, Ruby Beltrán, and the Chicano Park Steering Committee, as well as the people at USD at the Center for Educational Excellence. I am wanting to get right into what happened or the work I've been working on, and then I want to spend the second part of this presentation actually more talking about the theory and the analysis. At the forefront, there might be questions you might have in terms of how I did what I did, why I did it, and I'm hoping that I can answer those by the time we get to the end of this. I promise to leave as much time as possible at the end for conversation because this is most definitely a work in progress. And again, I am honored and humbled by your presence, and I really would like to learn from your perspectives, as many of you are further along on this journey than I am. This is relatively new for me in a way that it's just kind of awakened within me as an academic and as a person, but it's something I've been seeking out for many, many years. Let me then go to my first slide, and I want to sort of summarize what I want to do, kind of give you an outline. And you can see there that at the beginning I'm wanting to talk about the significance of contemplative practices for students of color at a private, predominantly white Roman Catholic university. Our campus is about 53% Caucasian. And I want to also add the category of marginalized students, not just students of color, because we have a whole range of different students along class lines around sexual identity that at times feel somewhat out of place at our campus. And since the establishment of ethnic studies, we've become sort of a haven for folks to come and share through our classes, through our office hours, and it's become quite important. And so in the attempt to work with contemplative practices, the idea is how do we get at that and how do we begin to affirm that through our work. You can see that the challenge that is before us is developing what I like to call relevant education, which is borrowed from the work of Glenn Omatsu in ethnic studies, and I'll refer to that later, but how do we make education relevant to the lives of students of color and marginalized students, and using contemplative practices to do that. Then I want to take us right into Chicano Park, where I situate the majority of this work. and I'll talk extensively about the park. I'll give you more context if you don't know what I'm making reference to because you haven't been here or you don't know the area. And then I have two contributions that I want to offer with regards to what ethnic studies can offer contemplative practices, contemplative studies, and I think vice versa, what can contemplative practices offer ethnic studies. And they're in two concepts, what I called situated contemplation and transgenerational knowledge. Then I borrow from the work of Laura Rendón and Vijay Kanagala what they call a new pedagogic imaginary. It's in my title, and I am very appreciative of their work because it helps give more context to what I'm doing. And then I want to end with something that I recently discovered in an essay that I wrote quite a few years ago, and a graduate student who was interviewing me about their work reminded me of this essay, and I just recently reread it, and boy, it spoke so deeply to me. And it's about what I want to call emotive scholarship, and what I think is at the core of what I'm trying to do with contemplative studies and the work that I'm doing. First thing I want to point out to you on this University of San Diego facts page is if people can look under the category of student at the bottom. We have 7,671 full-time students, and you'll see that we have an entering class of 1,105. We usually fluctuate between those numbers around 1105 to 1150. Notice what looks somewhat impressive to me, that our demographics, that 36% of our students at our university are put in the category of minority and 7% are international. One of the things that you will note about our campus immediately is the fact that it's on a beautiful part of a hill in San Diego overlooking the bay, and the beauty, the aesthetics of the campus is always being highlighted in terms of what the campus represents. And even at that level, I think there is an interesting sort of contemplative dimension to that that is always being raised by administrators and certain members of the faculty in terms of the work that we do. So I want to break this down, though, more around the 36% minority students, because quite honestly, when I saw this as I was preparing for this talk, it kind of took me back a bit, and I said, wow, that looks pretty powerful. And so then I found another page, thanks to colleagues who assisted me, and here we have federal reports for 2015. And you'll see here then that the numbers are actually a little bit differently in terms of if you break it down. And you have close to 19% Latino Hispanic students. American Indians are less than 1%. Asians are at 7%. Our Black and African American students are at 3%, and they've remained that low for quite a while since I've been at the university. Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders also very small, and there you see the number of 53% for white students. And so again, just to sort of ground the fact that we're dealing with issues around difference in our campus, and not only are the issues of race, there are issues of social class as well, because of the fact that it's a private institution with a fairly high tuition. I started to think about our students, and a young man came to mind, Huitzol Hernandez, who was a student of mine a few years ago. He's from a nearby community of Oceanside in a barrio known as Pozole. And I was thinking about him, and a student in his year had done some photographic essays, and he asked them to write a narrative around what they felt with regards to what the photograph is there. And you can see I'm trying just to move the panel here so I can read this. You can see what he says. He says, I wish to be accepted and heard along with other minorities at USD who treat their time here as a prison sentence. Do my time and get out. Diversity as it is sold should be seen in all its glory. And so this speaks to our students in terms of the displacement they feel, the alienation they feel. And this young man, to be honest with you, is still struggling with the completion of his degree. He's come back and seen me many times. He has some personal challenges. The distance between the university and his home is quite far, and we're still working on this, but he's still very committed. And again, to give you a sense of some of the challenges that our students are facing. Let me now take you to Chicano Park. You may recognize the date up on top because that is the establishment of Earth Day in the United States. And Chicano Park was established on that day 46 years ago. It's located in the community of Logan Heights. Logan Heights is probably 1 to 2 miles southeast of the downtown area of San Diego. The community is known for its large, diverse population, African American, Chicano, Mexican, immigrant, Asian American. The work there was mainly drawn for people who were interested in, there was a lot of work in the tuna industry. So many different groups came to work. The tuna industry has now since left the community, but you still have a predominantly Chicano barrio that has been around for quite a while. I did a lot of work in that community initially, looking at the history of the Catholic Church in that neighborhood, and there's a whole interesting history there. The park symbolizes a collective community struggle that began 46 years ago when the community organized a land takeover of a little piece of land under a bridge. I want to emphasize this. It was a land takeover. The park was not granted by the city of San Diego. The mayor didn't give a key to the community. It was a struggle. It was a political struggle, and it was based on self-determination, and it was deeply grounded in the Chicano movement. And to do more discussion on this, it actually comes from the work of Corky Gonzalez and the Crusade for Justice movement that was coming out of Denver, Colorado during the same period. And it had a major impact on what was happening at Chicano Park. And the whole question of cultural nationalism and the whole question of self-determination was at the center of this. Now what we have is we have the largest collection of outdoor murals in the world, okay? So what I need to add to this narrative is that when the community came to be, and when you finally had a bridge that was displaced hundreds of families, you had the bridge that's known as the Coronado Bay Bridge, and people were displaced, and artists came along a few years later and said, why don't we do something with these horrible pillars and paint murals on them? There was other issues related to a highway patrol station being placed in the area, and there's a lot more history there, but just to give you a sense of how this happened. Let me then share with you a map that I'm very proud to say that this was work done by me and my students over several years of work. So if you were actually flying over the park today, this is what it looks like. And you'll see, again, as I was trying to underscore just a few seconds ago, Interstate 5, which is at the top of this map, is the interstate that goes from the border all the way up through the state of California. That was the first thing to divide this neighborhood back in the early 60s. In the late 60s, there was conversation to link the island of Coronado with the main area of San Diego, the downtown area, and those lines then represent what's known as the Coronado Bay Bridge. And underneath those lines, of course, at one time was the community of Logan Heights. It's now disappeared. The highway is owned by Caltrans, which is our highway company here in California, and they're the ones who basically lease the land to the city of San Diego. There are 88 murals and sculptures. You can appreciate that by looking at the numbers, and then you see the corresponding images. As I said, I worked for a long time with students. We put this together. We've put a book together as well on this work. And so I started to think more about how could we utilize this work? How could we make it valuable in the work that we do, going back to the question of empowering our students and working with them. So this gives you a visual, if you've never been to the park, of what these look like. Here is the interstate, or I should say the Coronado Bay Bridge. This is the incredible work of Todd Stange, which I'm not doing justice to because this image is somewhat blown out in terms of the pixels, and so you can't see it very well. But you have Victor Ochoa's Barrio Logan mural, which is very famous, and of course we have Michael Schnorr's Undocumented Worker that was just redone in 2011. And you see how tall these are, and you see how beautiful they are, and they're basically an outdoor mural that is open to all. In fact, I usually give 4 or 5 tours a week. I'm going back tomorrow to give a tour to 4th graders from an elementary school here in town. So let me give you then the setting and the context for contemplative practices. And I just want to read this. The monumental murals of Chicano Park are transformed into what I call contemplative sites that invite individuals to partake in subjective, intersubjective, and emotive reflections as they encounter the history and narratives captured in the murals. The mural reflections are situated within the personal lives and social locations of individuals who participate. So this sort of introspective, intersubjective, autoethnographic sort of approach is what I'm wanting to do, and I'm wanting to use the contemplative methods and the contemplative work that has been done by so many others, by so many folks around the world in an attempt to do this. And this is where I would love more insight and understanding beyond of what I share with you today in terms of building this and working with it further. So just to quickly remind us of what we do in contemplative studies for folks who may not be aware, who are joining us for the first time in this area, we're interested in quieting the mind, we're interested in cultivating deep concentration, calm awareness, focusing on the present moment. You see that we take this from the important work, of course, that's being done by the center and the project they put together around the activist ally. And then we have activities which also come from the same project. And you'll notice that you might recognize all of these, but one that I added in here thanks to the work of one of my students, Ruby, is dance, folklorico. Okay, because that Ruby has an amazing story, which I'm sorry I can't share with you. I'm going to share a little bit of her work about her work later, but she came to the University of San Diego wanting to do ballet folklorico, the traditional Mexican dances. She found the university did not offer it, although it was advertised on the web page. So then she took it upon herself to create her own ballet folklorico. And when we talked about what she did, she recognized that it was deeply contemplative and very important. So it's just kind of fun to add that in there. And I'm sure as we deal with culturally relevant practices, like we're going to look at danzantes, indigenous dancing, it's also part of this whole experience as well. So how might ethnic studies contribute to this whole discussion around contemplative practices, and what is it that I'm interested in underscoring? Well, the first thing is that what we do within an ethnic studies framework, and as I said earlier, it's an epistemological question, is how do we open up the multiple truths and practices? How do we underscore what so many scholars have talked about in ethnic studies, about new ways of knowing? And then the deeper epistemological question about how do we know what we know? And then the last point here that I raise is, as I mentioned earlier, I'm tapping into the whole questions and wanting to address the questions of feelings and emotions tied to these new discoveries and these new awarenesses. Some scholars in Chicano studies call this as recovery research. It's about recovery. It's about affirming and unearthing things that maybe are hidden or unknown or have been silenced. That's at the core of a lot of this work. So with that in mind, here is what I see as the first unique expression and the first contribution to the contemplative act or to the contemplative experience, and that is what I'm calling situated contemplation. Contemplative practices are mindful of the deep concentration and awareness evoked by this practice, but they must be, and this is where I add sort of my ethnic studies point of view, grounded within a social, historical, political, and cultural perspective. I'm having a problem seeing my screen because I have this. Let me move this further. I'm sorry. Okay, there we go. Sorry. Cultural context that provides deep meaning and guidance that we refer to as situated contemplation. So what I'm trying to get at here is that this contemplation has to be situated. It can't be random. It has to have some context to it. And it must evoke a presence or a memory of a physical space and or material object. And what I state below that is that that physical space or material object can be something that is already in existence, like a mural at a park, or it can be something that's created. And here I want to just briefly mention my work in cajitas, which is what I started with a long time ago, and people like Laura Rendón recognized and worked with me on it, and actually was part of her book on Senti Pensante. So I want to talk a little bit about what those cajitas look like. I'll give you a reference because I can't spend a lot of time on this, but I want to give you a sense of how then we work with this. And here is an example of a cajita. This was a project that was done quite a few years ago by Melanie Fernandez at the University of California at Santa Barbara when I was a visiting professor there. And this cajita is in honor of her mother, who was a cannery worker in Watsonville. And you see there's images of her as a baby with her mother. You see the tomatoes, you see the box, you see the cans of Del Monte tomatoes at the top. And she wrote these expressions about this work. You have to express yourself emotionally. Those are your feelings, those are your thoughts. In my cajita, I found myself and I found my identity. And thanks to the work of Professor Rendón, these are some of the things that came out of what this pedagogy looks like. Inner and outer learning is connected, deeper learning experiences, work with emotions, reflective process and subjective use as well, such as reasoning, problem solving. Contemplative, and that involves the creation of a sacred space with the use of ritual rooted in culture. So there is an essay that I wrote about this work called The Living Color of Students, Color of Students, and it was published in Religion and Education in the fall of 2002. It's volume 29 if anybody would like to find that essay. The second unique expression that I wish to make reference to is what I call transgenerational knowledge. Situated contemplative practices represents an effective way to transmit culture and meaning across generations. Here, images and spaces provide some level of common understanding and shared knowledge. And the emphasis here is across generations, across families, across communities, the way people can bring together these ideas. You'll note that the categories on the column there, they are attributed to a color. And I want to talk a little bit about an exercise that Ruby and I did when we presented this in the last conference that was at Howard. And I'll talk about that in a second, but note that in there you have things such as people, memories, smells, hearing, sounds, feelings, difference, place, places, language, and then we even have an open category. So what we did, is we had pieces of blank paper and we looked at it almost as a canvas. And then we brought pieces of square paper that corresponded with the colors that you can see below here. And we asked people to evoke a presence or memory of a physical space or material object that affirms an existing way of knowing and or unveils new ways of knowing in your life. You really want to reflect on social, historical, political, and cultural contexts that provide deep meaning and guidance. So what I wanted to do is just take a moment and offer a little bit of silence and maybe contemplation here for you to give this some thought. And if it evokes some ideas, imagine you have this piece of paper in front of you, you have all these colors. What comes to your mind if you were going to do this? And unfortunately, because this is a webinar and we're not face-to-face, I want to move on after this moment of silence, but if people want to share these ideas at the end, I would love to hear them or at another time. And if you want to modify this in any way, by all means, it's just that whole objective of wanting to situate the contemplation and make it transgenerational in its representation. So I will be brief. I will be silent, and we will be silent for a minute for people to think about how this might work in your own life and to evoke those feelings and those thoughts about what you would develop here. Thank you. Moving on, I want to now give a few examples of a few experiences, a few, what I want to say, contemplative moments of students and colleagues who actually then took part in this activity. And I first began this project with my students in an advanced Chicano studies class. And as I said, Ruby Beltrán, one of my students who just finished her degree, really sort of responded to this and worked with me over the summer. And as I said, we presented this work in Washington, and we're continuing to work on this. But she chose a mural, a recent mural by the artist Coco Miller. And this is a contemporary image of Coatlicue. And Coatlicue, you need to know, is related to Mesoamerican culture, a very strong feminist identity, written about by people like Gloria Anzaldúa and others, and an incredible image. And we, at the park, it's interesting, there are 3 different Coatlicues there. This is the most contemporary. Ruby was able to get a hold of the artist, and you'll see that the narrative below is the artist's interpretation of this image. This isn't a very large piece. I would say it probably stands, I'm going to say about maybe 8 feet by, maybe 5 feet. It's not large like the bigger monumental murals. It's a smaller piece. You can read there what the artist was reflecting on as she was working on this. So then here is Ruby's reflection, and this is just a small part of it, and again, I'm not doing justice to this because she's the one who put this together and could speak about it in much more detail, and I just want to sort of share it with you at the moment. And we were working with these notion of feelings, as I mentioned before, but also with Laura's work around feelings and thinking. And so you see that in terms of what she writes. What came to her mind was sounds of the freeway, because you've got to realize there are hundreds and hundreds of vehicles going over your head continually because you're literally under a highway where the park is. The interactions with people, because she mentioned a lot of people came up to her, kind of interrupted her, asking her what she was doing. She was near a playground. There was a lot of kids playing. Feelings that came forward, the sentir, what it meant to be a Latina, what it meant to be a Chicana, what it meant to be a woman. She thought about that in relationship to not only being at the park, but what it meant to be in the classroom at USD. Thought. She started to then deal with the pensar, the intellectual aspects, the connections with women, the whole question of colonization, of religious female figures, of assimilation, synthesis, all these interesting sort of dynamics that she worked on. And then here's some text. Here is something that she actually wrote. At moments I felt proud to be a woman because I have a closer bond to this Mother Earth, this woman, this God, this deity of the Aztec Mexica people. I also felt proud to be a Latina, Chicana woman of color because of the knowledge that I have of my heritage. It's rare to be able to see my own histories and cultures being portrayed in the lovely form of a mural, let alone in public, to be shared with the whole community. One other thing that I was wanting to do, because as we were working with this, we really wanted to work with high school students. And to make a long story short, we had it all figured out, but the high school relationship with us fell through for a whole range of reasons. So what we were wanting to do was do pedagogy in addition to do the contemplative part of it. What could we read? What could we view? What could we understand better about what's in the mural to add to this? So as you see here, she references Anzaldúa's work, and she takes a quote, this notion of la facultad, and then the important work of Du Bois and his notion of second sight. And that to her speaks to what this mural teaches. And if we were going to move further with this, the idea was that we would want to do this with every single mural. We've started with a website, but because of time and because of commitments and other events, we have the beginnings of it, and at some point it would be wonderful to do this of every mural so that we could share this with anybody who's interested in doing this type of work, and then people could add to it and build on it as well. So this is just kind of a summary, a new pedagogic imaginary integrating ethnic studies into contemplative practices, unique and different contemplative expressions discovered in working with the monumental murals of Chicano Park. Such an orientation integrates ethnic studies methodology and an attempt to use contemplative practices in a diverse classroom. So just to kind of pull that section together. In February of this year, we were honored by the presence of Laura Rendón, who actually came and we did the same work that I was doing with my students, now with members of the faculty and members of the community, not to mention also members of the staff as well. And we began our activity under the kiosco. The kiosco is kind of the sacred center of the park. This is us actually underneath it. We brought in indigenous dancers, Mexica dancers, who are a big part of the history of the park. They're a big part of the history of the Southwest. These are dancers that are transnational, Mexico, the Southwest, who always come together around Chicano Park Day and any other sacred gatherings. And they're at the park probably every day except for the weekend, practicing and praying and, again, being deeply contemplative, something that maybe we've never thought about, but here it is, and here it's represented. And I had this as an audio, but because of technical challenges, we're not able to share that. But if you heard what was happening during this scene, it really speak to you. So the event was one where we then, as you see in the left-hand corner, the danzantes giving a blessing to the four quadrants, the 4 points. Then we had our colleagues going and contemplating a mural of their choice. We have a colleague there sitting under the kiosco, and the image above is the image of the founding of the great city of Tenochtitlan. And the colleague that's sitting there is originally from Mexico City, and she remembers growing up with that memory as a child. So she wrote about that, and she developed it. With guidance from Professor Rendón, she said to me, why don't we also have everybody do cajitas? And I said, wow, that's kind of interesting. Long story short, we ended up doing it. You see that in the picture in the middle, where once the colleagues were part of this experience, they went ahead and took one of these boxes, and I had numerous things there, from pictures to paper mache to the whole 9 yards, and people created boxes. And here are my colleagues there, and you can see Laura there in the center as we're sort of taking in the event and remembering and reflecting and contemplating of what happened. I wanted to share what one colleague wrote, actually a community member, a very active community member, and she picked the famous mural of Cuauhtémoc. This mural was done in 1978 by Felipe Aldame, and he has restored it in 2012. And then my next image, I have my friend and colleague Josie Talamantes, who's a historian, an archivist, who's responsible for the National Registry designation of the park because of her years and years of work at the park. And you'll see that behind her are those cajitas that colleagues created. This was the following day. The first day was the work out at the park, bringing people together, leaving the campus, bringing community people in, and trying to do this work. And so again, I had this beautiful narrative here that I can't do justice to, but I'm going to just share a couple of quotes from what she shared. Here she was actually sharing with the group about her box. I'm sorry I don't have a closer up image of it, but it was about Chicano Park and about this mural and about what it meant. And I want to read just a couple of statements from her that she read during this presentation. And here's what she writes. She says, "This park evokes within me all of my family, friends, and ancestors who remain in spirit in this community. It is difficult to choose one mural to focus on. I reminisce on a wonderful tree by the children's playground on the hill. As a child, my family lived where the park is, and that was our tire rope tree where we swung around." So again, just another example and that sort of empowering aspect of the work that was done. And I personally was so moved because I didn't imagine this kind of depth and power that came from these conversations and how it was evoked through the contemplation, through the work that was done, the mindfulness that was brought forward. It's very powerful. And many, many examples are also available through my colleagues, but unfortunately we don't have time to go through those. So I've been throwing around this idea of pedagogic imaginary, and I want to make sure people understand what I'm making reference to. It's from an essay by Rendón and Kanagala, and you see it cited below by Tobolowsky, Embracing Contemplative Pedagogy in a Diverse Classroom, in a book entitled Paths to Learning. And here's what they define as a new pedagogic imaginary. An imagined vision that embraces cultural diversity and social justice, needed to engage in sensitive and reflective critical dialogue while creating space for students to enter conversations with a sense of openness and trust that is complemented with mindfulness, mutual respect, understanding, willingness to learn, care, and concern. And what they do is they come up with some critical teaching and learning objectives. And as you look at the left column here, these are the objectives that they have been able to discover or that are important when doing work this way, and why it's so critically important. Where deeper meaning is what is being learned in and out of the classroom is discovered, where voice is discovered, healing, insight is gained, pain released, coming to terms with anger and shadow of life. And what I attempted to do here in my attempt to synthesize this within my own work, I tried to just bring some sense of correspondence with what I was making reference to around either situated contemplation, transgenerational knowledge, both, autoethnography, and it was the beginnings of that work, and I just wanted to share that. And then there's more here that they offer, where connection with others and new relationships are established, where love, joy, passion, and compassion is expressed, where resiliency is developed, engagement with culturally relevant practices, civic awareness along with personal and social responsibility is cultivated. Again, you see corresponding categories or developments through my work. And what might be different here is this notion of self-determination, which, as I said earlier, is at the core of a lot of the work that's been happening here in San Diego around the Chicano community, around the work that's being done in Logan Heights. And I want to just say quickly, Logan Heights right now is really under a great deal of siege because of gentrification. As we're seeing it in San Francisco and other major cities, we are losing quickly our sense of community, our sense of culture, and to be quite frank with you, the park is the last stand. And I am doing my best, as well as others are, to preserve what that represents. And at days, I feel it's a losing battle, and it's difficult. And so this is how the contemplative project can help in terms of affirming and validating the value of this community, that it just didn't appear yesterday, but it's been here for a long, long time, and it will be here for a long, long time after. And it's really, really important to highlight. I mentioned that I recently reread an essay I wrote a few years ago, and I talked a lot about this thing called emotive scholarship, and it really just blew my mind to go back and read this and see how it speaks deeply to what I'm trying to get at with all of this work. It really culminates for me years of thinking about this, sort of in these dark paths that I wasn't sure where I was going, unclear about why I was thinking about this. And I think this really says it for me. If I wanted to summarize everything that I've been trying to share and the value of what I'm trying to share, it's in this slide. That we want to recognize emotive scholarship and teaching in the new pedagogic imaginary, because the new pedagogic imaginary allows us to feel. And I know it is inferred in what the work that's being done by Rendón and Kanagala is, but I want to really underscore that for myself. And you'll see at the bottom, I cite this essay that this comes out of, Engraving Emotions, Memory and Identity and the Quest for Emotive Scholarship, in a publication known as Cross Currents in summer of 2004. And the whole essay speaks about my own life growing up and this desire since I was a small child to honor and validate my feelings, because those feelings lead to my own truth and my own understanding, and it speaks to my journey in ethnic studies and why I do the work that I do. Then I think it's really can't be said any better than who I consider the Dean of Ethnic Studies, Ron Takaki at UC Berkeley, who started there years ago in '68, '69 when they started Ethnic Studies, and he really challenges us in his work in a larger memory to develop what he calls a narrative history And here it says it all in this quote. This narrative history is where we honor and discover the experiences, feelings, adjustments, imaginings, hopes, understandings, dreams, fears, regrets, tragedies, and triumphs that compose our past. So that is a big part of what's going on. The other thing that I wanted to quickly mention, that in going back and reading this emotive scholarship essay, I had forgotten how close I had worked with a penitente. The penitentes are from New Mexico, a community that has always been misunderstood as flagellants and these kind of outlaw individuals from northern New Mexico, kind of these fanatics. And I worked many years with a brother there, Hermano Juan Sandoval, and I went back and I read that essay and how much I learned from him. And in reading that essay, I was really moved by what he spoke about and how he really helped me understand the value of this thing I'm calling emotive scholarship. So I conclude with this slide. Ethnic studies within contemplative studies allows us to focus on a pedagogy or a teaching method that will affirm students and make them more aware and mindful of themselves and others. And my first point here, and one thing that I came to realize with students like Aoi, who I featured earlier here, and others, is that I strongly believe when I started to pull this work together and I started to think about it, that students who are marginalized, students of color, students, queer students who feel not accepted in certain communities, already possess an inherent sensibility for awareness and mindfulness because they don't have a privilege. They don't possess that privilege where they have the ability to take everything for granted. I think students who are more privileged are more difficult to get in touch with that feeling, to really get in touch with what that means. But I can speak from experience. You go into a setting where you know you feel somewhat out of place. You have to become quickly mindful. You have to be quickly contemplative, to think about what is going on around you, and how do you then adapt to that. It goes back to this notion of Du Bois and all the other things that I was referencing earlier. So that's really important. I think we need to really work on that when working with students of color, because I think it can really enhance their success and their place in higher education. I also think this question of a dialectical journey is very much is really open to us through a contemplative approach. It takes in both the conflicts and the consensus, the coexistence of them, these double entendres that people write about, what Anzaldúa writes about with regards to the borderlands. You're able to sort that through with this approach, and I think it's represented in some of the things, the examples that I provided here. And then here's the statement again that I ended this presentation, that I just spoke about a few minutes ago. It allows us to affirm, to feel the unacknowledged attributes of students of color and marginalized students. The feeling is what makes things truthful, regardless if they're feelings of pain or feelings of joy, and the feelings, to allow yourself to feel them and to experience them, I think are really important. And then finally, it guides us and orients us towards a path of self-awareness, self-healing, and personal transformation. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I'm looking forward to conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your work through this beautiful presentation, Alberto. And at this point, I'd like to invite everyone to feel free to type in your questions and your reflections. And we're going to have just a few minutes of silence on our end to allow you to reflect on the presentation and have some time to gather your thoughts and type in your questions into the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. Okay, some questions are starting to come in. Here's one from Sharon. Alberto, can you speak more about instances of self-healing and personal transformation?
Self-healing and personal transformation. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to speak about that in terms of my own life or in terms of my students' lives. I would say that within my own life, I see this whole experience as a fairly long and detailed journey, and the more I learn, the more I become aware, the more I'm closer to that fullness that I'm wishing to seek. I see it with my students when, for lack of a better term, the light comes on, or I really see that they connect the dots and they become empowered and feel whole. And I think that's reflected in their skills, in their successes, not only not only academic successes, but in their personal lives. And so that would be the way I would begin to understand that. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not doing that type of work. But what I'm really trying to do is within the pedagogical perspective, or within the teaching framework, how we can begin to impact on the lives of those students.
Thank you. Patricia has submitted a question that I'd like to take a liberty of expanding on slightly. She asks, can you talk about an example when students contemplated a particular historical event? And that made me wonder, in general, how you structure the reflections with the students. Do you leave it very open-ended, or do you often provide a certain theme or structure for the exercises?
There is a structure, and I honestly think it's still evolving. As you see here with this presentation, I think that this recent publication by Laura and Vijay is very helpful, because now those learning outcomes are very helpful to begin to sort of identify those and begin to develop them. Initially, we began a lot with just sort of general ideas about what it means to think and what it means to feel as it relates to the sentipensante paradigm. But I think now we can engage that a lot deeper in terms of some of the categories that I've attempted to present here. I also think that, again, based on this presentation, I think we should get more into the questions about what is the role of the emotive in our life? What is the role of the emotive as scholars? I think that's a big part of what I'm really wanting to articulate. There was something else I was going to reference, but I want to emphasize the fact, and I think it might come across in this presentation, this isn't just for students of color. I think that everybody can offer insights. I've worked with majority students, I've worked with international students, and everybody has their perspective and their framework in terms of how to do that. But yeah, I would just say that it's evolving and it's developing, and I do have some handouts and stuff I'd be happy to share if people want to contact me.
Thank you. I don't want Patricia's original question to get lost in mine, though, which was, has there ever been a contemplation situated around a particular historical event? Has that been a way that you've...
No, that's really interesting. No, I have not thought about that. I think that's a really good question. No, I think that you assume the historical event because the existence of the park, the materiality of the park in itself is a historical event. But to actually literally look at it that way, I think that's a pretty cool idea. And see, what I think we've done more than anything is make it more autobiographical and necessarily not more structural. And I think that's maybe what she may be getting at in terms of the perspective. So I think that's quite interesting. It reminds me of what C. Wright Mills would talk about with regards to the relationship between history and biography, and how biography is so intimately tied to our history and vice versa. And so that's really quite cool. I can see where you could even teach a class where you don't even have to go to the park. You can just talk about historical events and make them contemplative. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that actually ties into Paula's question. She says, I teach literature and mindfulness in a community with a significant population of new refugees from diverse countries such as Nepal, Congo, Afghanistan. Do you see an application outside of a specific physical space like the park, in an imagined space inside the classroom for this pedagogy?
That's what I attempted to do with the little cards and the colors. I know it's not very sophisticated, but it's kind of where we began. And I would love to dialogue more with you about that, and sort of maybe the beginning point could be what the idea was with regards to what that represented. Because when we did that at DC, at Howard, we heard some beautiful stories. Anything from someone who spoke about this pan, or this ceramic bowl where all the food was made at home over the years, and how many beautiful things came out as a result of that. And so you most definitely, and if it wasn't clear, that was my intent with regards to what I tried to do with those colors and the whole idea. But I would love to talk more about that based on that idea.
Let's see. Jesse is responding to your call for emotive pedagogy, and says, my Western philosophy-trained colleagues, however, are skeptical of affirming emotions as a viable way to knowing. Certainly understandable. How do you justify emotive knowledge with academics?
That's a really good question. Well, Jesse, I would say to you that because I'm in this field of ethnic studies, our attempt is to establish what we call the counter-narrative and to acquire knowledge outside of the academic realm. I 100% agree with you that it's met with a lot of resistance. The work we do is continually met with a lot of resistance, but I would ask that we get creative. And again, at the foundation of our work in terms of what we do in ethnic studies is to challenge those master narratives, those master canons of ways of knowing, and begin to think of alternative ways of knowing. Definitely there's always going to be naysayers, and they're not going to accept this, but there definitely is a community out there that's doing work in ethnic studies, in feminist studies, in queer studies. All those areas are opening that up in terms of looking at this from another perspective.
And Cecilia is wondering if you would be willing to discuss any connections you've explored between students' activism and their use of contemplative and emotive experiences. Does their activism and community organizing increase or strengthen?
That's kind of a I think that's kind of like a what do I want to say? Maybe an unintended goal or objective that I would hope would happen, and I think I'd have to be more methodical in terms of tracking something like that. I'd have to sit down and think about it, but I would say in theory the students become much more whole in who they are, and therefore it allows them to move forward on some of these issues with a lot more incentive and a lot more affirmation. I would love to try to map that out in a much more direct way, because I've always felt that when we graduate our students, a lot of our students have had to survive some pretty difficult situations, and so the fact that they're getting through speaks a lot to their own sort of resilience and sort of their new ways of knowing as a result of going through the experience. So I don't have anything but anecdotal information, and I would appreciate, the idea of actually thinking of how we could make this more direct and much more concrete, I guess, is the way to say it.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question, and this one is very particular to this point in time. It's from Sandra, and she says, thank you for your presentation, and it looks like, based on her question, that you will be working with some fourth graders on a tour of the park tomorrow. Does that sound right? Yeah, she says, will you do any emotive work or reflection with the fourth graders on the tour tomorrow? If so, what might you do? And if not, why not? Like, how do you make decisions about how to work with a particular group of students?
You know what I've done with fourth graders, and I think it's emotive, is I will start, you can't give this away, Sandra, this is going to give away my presentation. I always talk because you know that's a tough group to work with because you're not going to talk politics, you're not going to talk about these larger sort of theoretical intellectual ideas. But quickly, what I'll do is I will ask them about what does home mean to them. What is home? What does home feel like? What does place feel like? What is it that you feel secure about? And when I've done this before with kids, you know what they tell me? Their bedroom, their bed, clean sheets. All those issues that are relevant to who they are. And then I then take that idea and I just basically link it to what the park is for many of us. That's exactly what it is. It is a bed. It is a home. It is a sense of belonging. And it really works. And so how I might be able to make that more emotive, I think I would have to probably do work that's beyond what we do on the tour because the tour is a little bit differently. It might be able to evolve into something like that, or maybe we could begin to create those types of tours, but I would have to really run it through the steering committee who really sort of helps organize all this and does the work. But if you have any ideas, and if you're the person I'm meeting tomorrow, by all means, let me know when you get there, and we'll see if there's a way we could do a little bit of this in the presentation tomorrow.
Excellent. Okay. All right, I see it's 2:59 by my clock, so we've got to wrap things up. And I want to, extend so much gratitude again, Alberto, for your presentation today, and to everyone who joined us and asked great questions. So we did record this webinar, and I'll do my best to get it edited and up on our website in the next couple of days. And I'll send everybody who registered an email with a link to the recording, and it'll be on our website. It's contemplativemind.org/webinars for you to view in perpetuity. And we have webinars going back to about 2009 on a variety of topics in contemplative education and from a variety of disciplines. So I encourage you to review this webinar again and to see the other resources that we have available. And these webinars are made possible with your support, so we invite you to make a donation on our site when you check out the webinar archive. All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon and a great rest of your week. Thank you for listening.